All right, let's see. Attendees. Hello, everyone. We're just going to take a couple of seconds to let people join the Zoom room here, and then we'll get started. All right, we're going to get started. And if people are going to keep coming in while I'm speaking here. So hello, everyone. My name is Matt Kolaski, and I am the Manager of Public Programs at the Michener Art Museum. I am beyond excited to welcome you all out there in the internet to our very first virtual Earth Day. I hope you're having a great virtual Earth Day or IRL Earth Day, wherever you are. I've got a couple of quick announcements, and then we'll get straight to our panel, okay? First, as we all get used to attending virtual events, the Michener wants to make sure that we are providing you with the best possible experience online. If you have a moment after today's event, we ask that you consider completing this quick virtual program survey, which I'm gonna put over in the chat box right now. There we go. Next, we know now more than ever the museum and the arts are our window to a wider world. And all of us at the Michener are very thrilled to have your support today by joining us. If you like what you see and you were able to do so, we encourage you to make a donation to our annual fund. Every contribution, big or small, makes a huge difference in our ability to continue to present programs like this at no cost, both now and in the future. You can make that donation at this link, which I'm going to post right now. Next, I want to let you all know that while the Michener, the museum itself, is temporarily closed, you can still experience a lot of the museum from your home. We've collected all of our online resources for adults, kids, students, and teachers in one beautiful resource spot on our website. And I'm going to provide that link right now. Don't worry, I'll provide all these links again at the end of the event. Last, I want to go over some of the tech that we'll be using today in this virtual Zoom room. Because this is a webinar, only the hosts, myself, and the panelists will be able to see and hear each other. Those of you participating at home as attendees, feel free to vacuum in your pajamas. Just like TV, we won't be able to see or hear you. But that doesn't mean that you can't participate. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see two buttons, a chat feature and a Q&A feature. You can use that chat button to chat with all of the participants and the panelists. If you have specific questions for the panelists, you can type those in the chat box or in this Q&A function here too. I'll be looking at all of those during the panel, and we'll be drawing from those to give questions to our amazing panelists. All right, let's see here. I think that's it. What I want to do now is introduce our panelists for today's panel. First, we have Dylan Chang and Ben Chang from Pennsbury High School. Hey, Dylan. Hey, Ben.
Hey, how's it going?
Next, we have Victoria, who is a student at Del Valle University. Hello, Victoria.
Everyone.
Hello. And next, we have Lily, who is a student at Central Bucks South. Hello, Lily.
Hello.
Hello. All right. So I would now like to take a moment for those watching out in the internet. Take a moment to welcome our panelists. You can do this by, in the chat box, typing your favorite plant. So I'm going to type cactus. And we'll welcome our panelists here. So first question, I want each of you to introduce yourself, anything about the school that you go to, but I want to specifically hear how you are involved in the climate change movement and why it's important to you. So Dylan and Ben, do you all want to go first?
Sure thing.
Yeah, sure. I guess I got involved about a year and a half ago or so, and I sort of really got inspired when I saw like those sunrise protesters who were occupying Nancy Pelosi's office, and just that promise of young people sort of standing up to safeguard their futures. And then as I've become more of an animal liberationist and got more into the vegan movement, as I've gotten more into the anarchist movement, into the anarchist scene, I've sort of, incorporated my views on, ecological restoration and local green production into the wider scope of what I believe in. So in a sense, I think that this idea, to me, the idea that's always been, furthest in my mind in terms of, how do we restore a relationship to the planet? It's really about, creating a relationship with nature where we're in harmony with it. That includes plants, all the animals, and not above it. And that's something that certainly, indigenous people really understood. We've lost that with the Western colonialists coming in, because now we have this idea that we're above nature. And my main sort of, for me, the impact that I want to have on the climate movement, what I want to really start a discussion about is how do we, start that process going? How do we restore our relationship with nature again?
Yeah, so I think definitely, got to hand it to Dylan because he's inspired me a lot in my views, definitely, politically and relating to climate, really most things. So basically what Dylan had done was he started a local sunrise movement chapter at our school, Pennsbury High School. And then eventually I became co-leader of that with him and just started taking more responsibility. And that's been a lot of fun. It's definitely it's been great to get more involved. It feels very fulfilling, especially when it comes to the animal liberationist scene. We've been doing a little bit of work with the general strike that's ongoing and just trying to bring some more adequate and just climate demands and animal liberationist demands to its constitution. As of right now, there aren't any, so we thought that was a really important thing to address. And similar to what Dylan's been saying, in a sense, I think that our relationship with the world kind of starts at our table. It starts with our family and our homes. And to me, it starts with that kind of non-market relationship of the family, the idea of caring for each other without really expecting anything in return. And the way that we kind of adopt that belief over one that's sort of, is a bit more, individualistic and greed-based, a belief that capitalism does reward in some sense. And it just seems very important for me to kind of shift the debate on the climate from more like, is this something we can stop, to more from one of assumption to action in that sense, something mostly regarding our relationships with animals as well.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Dylan.
And I need the bathroom right now, so I'll just be heading out. I'll be coming back soon. So
okay.
Yeah. Bye.
Hi, Victoria. How about you?
So at Del Val, I volunteer with an organization called Feel Good, which raises money and awareness with the goal of eliminating world poverty. And through that, I learned that one of the major contributors to keeping people in poverty is climate change and extreme weather events. So that really opened my eyes to both of those issues. And then also, as I'm majoring in zoology, I plan to specialize in marine science after my undergrad studies. And I'm realizing that a lot of research needs to be done into how the climate is affecting marine environments and their ecological communities. So that's just how I feel climate change connects to me personally.
Great. Thank you, Victoria. Lily, how about you?
So I am the founder and leader of a local environmental justice and climate action group called BScape, which stands for Buck Students for Climate Action and Protection of the Environment. What we've been doing is we've been hosting events like climate strikes and sign making parties and just like summits where we basically just teach people about things that are like causes and effects of climate change. And what our current project right now is, actually we're raising money for a greenhouse, which we're going to build either, we're not sure exactly where, but it's going to be somewhere near Doylestown, which is going to be easily accessible to people, and it's going to serve as like a climate education center. How it connects to me personally is that pretty much my whole life I've just always felt this really intense connection to nature, and in the same way that Ben and Dylan were talking about, that like I really just felt like the way that humans were living was not the way that I believe that we should be living in terms of our relationship with nature. And so I always believed in a way of life that more is more represented by indigenous ways of life. And so last year, what actually inspired me to finally make an organization on myself was that I visited and volunteered on a Native American farm in the Southwest in New Mexico, and just being able to see their way of life actually up close and personal was just something that so inspired me, because it had inspired me forever, but to actually see that and see that there is another way to live that isn't based on capitalism and isn't based on environmental destruction, and that it actually is possible despite the fact that we are conditioned to believe that it's not. One of the Native American, one of the leaders, she has her own nonprofit permaculture institute, which is self-sustaining agriculture. She built her own house from adobe clay and her own forest by herself when she was 22 and pregnant. So just being able to see that is so incredible to me, because it really just said, like, this way of life is possible, and all you have to do is just go out and do it. Just stop thinking about it and just go out and do it. Use what nature gave you. Stop adhering to capitalistic Western ideology that says that you are separate, and just really it's possible, even though people want you to believe that it's not. So that's really what inspired me to start BScape, which is something that I had been thinking about for years.
Great, thank you for sharing that, Lily. Related to this, I wanted to ask Victoria or Ben, if either one of you had a specific experience, either reading a book or seeing a movie or something that happened to you in real life that really shaped your understanding or crystallized your thinking around climate change. Lily just shared the story about that time she spent on the reservation. I'm wondering if you had similar experiences with a book or a video or in real life that you want to share.
Yeah, so I think that one paper that really inspired my personal views and helped to shape them a whole lot was Professor Jem Bendel's Deep Adaptation, which essentially outlines changing the dialogue on adapting to our climate and the environmental destruction that's been brought about. It outlines how can we change this from the assumption that climate change is just kind of gonna, like it'll happen, but we can deal with it, to like, when it does happen, how are we going to adapt? How are we going to really change our societies to face this oncoming crisis, it really helped ground in reality for me what's going to occur and kind of what stage we're at in this process of fighting climate change.
Great, thank you. Victoria, did you have a specific moment or something that you can call to mind that really helped catalyze your experiences around this issue?
I think for me, it's been more like a series of events. Like one of the most, I think, formative memories for me in terms of being aware and invested in environmental issues was the BP oil spill in 2010. And I would have been around 11 when that happened. And I just remember seeing all the images from the site and basically learning how big corporations will take risks like that all the time for the sake of profit, even at the expense of the environment. So that sort of like stuck with me for a long time. And even in high school, I remember when the current presidency came into effect and we started to see the actions that they were taking to revoke environmental protections, really made me realize how bad the situation could get with people who don't have the environment as their best interest, like in power.
Thank you, Victoria, for sharing that. The next question I want to ask everyone is related to what we've been talking with. I want to ask, what role do you believe that the government plays or will play in the climate catastrophe issue that we're addressing? What role can it play positively? What role can it play negatively? Does Ben or Dylan, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so I definitely, have thought and hoped for a long time, and I still do, that the government could be taking a more active role in, protection of the environment. I certainly have been a supporter of the Green New Deal. That's kind of how I got into climate, because before, I was kind of, I thought it was too sciencey, but the Green New Deal seemed like a good way to, address that. However, I think that after seeing Bernie Sanders drop out and sort of reading more about the role that capitalism is playing in accelerating this climate crisis, because you have all this deforestation and pollution happening in a for-profit economy, I began to grow more skeptical about the possibility the government could really play a role in ending this. We're using certainly something with the Green New Deal that talks a lot about is renewable energy. Which is great. It's a great idea. But the fact is that even something like renewable energy, it's using up so much, of the energy, the water that we need. The idea with the Green New Deal is that the government would simply be managing the global economy to mitigate some of the effects of climate change. And that's fine. But something that, I've been, as an anarchist, as the eco-anarchist, have read a lot about is the idea of getting away from this idea of a global economy more to the idea of a local economy. Sort of building up sustainable communities on our own, separate from states and private capitalists, and growing our own food, and building, whether it be through co-ops, community land trusts, sustainable economies at the local level that don't have to do with everything that we do with traveling all over the world, using up all this fuel. We have this capitalist economy where they're pumping out all these goods that, a fridge that lasts like 4 or 5 years and then it gets thrown in the landfill. That's putting all this methane into the air. And that's something that I think, a lot of Green New Deal advocates, me included, haven't really been thinking about. And so when you have this giant behemoth government that's just going to come in and it's going to, end up regulating and managing the environment with this renewable energy, what we need to do is we need to change the way that we relate to nature. I think we can only do that on a local level and build self-sufficient, sustainable communities. The government, I think it's too wedded to private capital to change that relationship.
Ben, did you have any things you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Matt. So like Dylan was saying with the global economy, essentially, the international exchange of goods and services, that's just something that's really just embedded in our daily lives, rooted there. I mean, my shirt's from Vietnam, but I've never been there. I haven't set foot in that country ever. And everything we have really, like, even the concept of things such as like 2-day shipping, 1-day shipping, it's just the amount of resources that are expended in processes such as that to satisfy consumers are just It's really quite mind-boggling, when you just look at the figures. And one other like really major contributor to climate change that I think like the government and private capital, much as I would like to see it end, like won't change this, is the idea of animal agriculture. So this is something that's responsible for more greenhouse gas emissions than all transport combined, including, transport of goods like this shirt I'm wearing or other goods that we use daily. So animal agriculture does contribute to ocean dead zones, species extinctions, but most importantly, I think, is just the ethical responsibility, paired, of course, with the environmental one that we have towards our fellow human beings and our fellow animals, non-human and human animals. So that's a really important concept to me, just recognizing that animals are individuals and they're moral beings, right? Should be treated as such. That was something that was outlined pretty clearly in the Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness. So sort of like the environment, it's like there are some issues that I think it takes a lot of thinking to really come to terms with and to kind of not turn our backs on, because when it comes down to it, we do want to care about those who we share the earth with. And, similar to kind of just letting things happen with climate change, we don't want to just let things continue the way they are relating to animal agriculture. We want to help end suffering, reduce it, and create a more habitable planet for everybody.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Dylan. Lily or Victoria, did you want to add anything about this question of what role do you think the government plays in climate change, or both positively and negatively?
Yeah. So this is pretty much the number one focus of Bscape, because we believe that the most immediate effects on climate come from the amount of regulation that the government is able to and willing to pursue, as opposed to individual habit. Because while individual habit is extremely important and it does cause a ripple effect, the majority of greenhouse gases comes from these corporations and it comes from these processes. And the reason why these companies are able to work the way that they do is because of the lack of oversight from the government. The government has the power to shut these things down. It does, and it has in the past, and they do not use it. And it's because of this allowance of the US government specifically to let these hyper-capitalist, very wasteful companies use up these resources, dump in these rivers, and really harm the way of life for millions of people. And the U.S. has such a so on the topic of global economy, of course, I agree with Dylan and Ben completely that things need to change because it's so completely wasteful. But I do also think that we have to be realistic when we talk about these kinds of things. And I do think that it's very unlikely that within the next century or so that people as a whole are going to be willing to eliminate a global economy. And I feel like in that way, we should be pursuing ways to make the global economy more eco-friendly before we can move into shutting it down completely, because globalism is really ingrained in all of our way of life. And because of that, the key to making the global economy more sustainable is through government action, because the government is primarily responsible for the input and export of goods. They have the ability to lever tariffs. They have the ability to control, in some cases, the foreign market. And so because the US has such a powerful global presence economically, it would be really aligned with the US always says, like, we're the best, we're like the number one, we're like the leaders of the world is what like the US government likes to say about the United States. And I feel like there's a chance for us to really actually put that talk into practice by using our power and our influence to kind of make ourselves and other countries come together to solve this issue. And by leveraging our goods or services and our wealth as a nation to get these countries to form, including ourselves, to form an alliance that will help to bring down global emissions and all of that stuff, and basically just help regulate the global economy, would be one of the most important things that we could do as a country. And that comes from the governments being willing to stand up to corporations, stand up to multinationals, and take that lead that it claims that it takes and is able to take.
Great. Thank you, Lily. Victoria, did you want to add anything before we move on?
Yeah, first of all, wow, those are some really good points by all of you guys. I just wanted to add about getting back to like the economy. As long as we have a capitalist society, there will be no incentive other than profit for companies to change the way they do things, to rely on more sustainable sources, to do things more sustainably, until consumers make that demand. So as individuals, I would say we can influence our government by voting with our dollar, because these companies obviously have some influence in the government as well through lobbying, and through voting and speaking out and supporting those officials that we can elect into offices that have our values and can put those policies into practice.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for your thoughtful answers for that. And I also want to remind everyone listening that if you have questions for the panelists, you can type those in the Q&A function of Zoom here, or you can put them in the chat, and we'll get to those towards the end of the program. The next question I want to get to is that, you know, the emphasis for this panel was to see what a specific generation of students are addressing and viewing this, the climate change crisis. What I want to ask is, how do you see older generations viewing this same issue? And if they're viewing it differently, what do you think causes that difference in perspective? Also, how do you bridge that gap in difference of perspective and thinking? And then looking the other way, what about younger generations? How do you think they will view this topic? And how do we communicate with them the important facets, or from your view, the important ideas that are within this very, very important issue? Victoria, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. I definitely think that there's a difference between like our generation and older generations in how we see this crisis, and I think it's because for the younger generation it presents a more imminent threat. Like, we will more likely see the effects of this in our lifetime. But it obviously varies from person to person. I think that for future generations, it's all about, it's sort of like, I think past generations grew up not hearing as much about it. So it wasn't as imminent a threat or as prominent in their mindset. So I think for future generations, it's about keeping these movements going and putting these policies into practice, or as much as we can, and making sure that, you know, if one thing, you know, is successful, oh yay, we did it, and then like not just stopping after one success, keeping it going for generations, because even after we're gone, like, the earth is still here and we don't want to repeat past mistakes.
Thank you, Victoria. Lily, do you have thoughts here?
Yes. So like when we think about the older generations, we also have to consider like the events that happened in our country's history while they were younger. And I think that there's been a heavy history of propaganda in the United States that has kind of shaped the opinions of older generations, whether it's opinions of other cultures, for example, a sort of bias that came about because of the world wars, that came about because of the Cold War, and Vietnam and everything, and even the Red Scare, things like that, where the US government has utilized their influence and propaganda to really form their opinions. And I think that these things have really created a collective consciousness that is more concerned about national security and materialistic ideals and global trade and everything like that, and less concerned about the like environmental sustainability and the morals of younger generations. And I just think that this is like just a cultural divide, because at this point, now we're growing up, like our generation is growing up with media, social media, which definitely plays a role in it, because in a positive way, because there's more of a chance to read and experience other people's opinions. There's much more out there than maybe there was if you were just watching your television, if you were just watching the US government broadcast, you were just reading the paper. There's much more of a way for us to explore different ideas and really be able to determine our own kind of sense of what's going on in the world than necessarily there was back in like the 50s. And I feel like that plays a really important role, because it's just such a big mixture of different ideas and views. And I feel like that defines our generation much more, because we are able to be more like, we are conditioned to being more open-minded because we have genuinely more access to different opinions and different ideas.
Great. Thank you, Lily. Ben or Dylan, do you want to address this question real quick?
Yeah, so I think that, like, as Lily and Victoria were saying, like, definitely, I think when the major splits with the older and younger generations, that the older generation, you know, especially people I've talked to here in the local Democratic Party, they tend to see climate change and the climate crisis as something that's kind of far off. Like, you know, obviously it's a problem, but, you know, just kind of do zero carbon emissions by 2050, 100% renewable energy by 2050, and we will be fine. Whereas the younger generation, because it's something that affects us more, this is definitely something that we are more concerned about. Now, the question of how to go about it in the younger generation, there's definitely a split. I think there are those who favor more government action, and then there are those like myself who would rather, you know, push the government through stuff like general strikes and walkouts to put in policies like the Green New Deal, because I don't want to get them any pressure wrong. I very much support it, but we are less, I will say, anyone on the more libertarian side like myself, definitely less supportive of going through the government to get that. So it's interesting to see, because you don't only have this split between the older and younger generation, but you also have a split even among the younger generation itself, from the more reformist side to the more radical side. But definitely one of the things I think is going to define really the debate on climate in the next couple decades is the older and younger generation, because we are very different in the way that we see it.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that's really interesting to me is the idea of how is this debate formed between the older and younger generations. So one institution that reflects this debate to me is the general scientific research and papers produced on climate change, because if you examine them, most of them are really just operating on the assumption that, like Dylan said, you know, climate change is bad, but it's something in the future we don't really have to worry about it. But what I would really like to see, and I greatly encourage, is a consideration, just an honest one, an open-minded one, of the possibility that climate change is not necessarily something we can stop, but that it's something that we have to adapt to. And part of how we go about building local power and how we adapt like now before things get more serious is just simply having open conversations with those we love and our friends, family, neighbors, people we know, because that's a way to me to just on an individual level to break down that barrier between the older and younger generation and just, really just get to talking with people, seeing where they stand, expressing your views, and really just having a solid conversation.
Right. And I think that one of the ways that we really saw this, and I don't think that this movement is quite as strong as it was before, was I know y'all.
This movement meaning climate movement?
No, I'm talking about something different. I know y'all remember, I bet y'all remember the whole yellow vest thing that was happening in France, about a year ago, a couple months ago. That really started when people in their communities were having these conversations on the individual level, like Ben was saying, about income inequality, austerity. Obviously, it's not climate, it's a different issue, but eventually they sort of worked up from that and were able to collectivize a little more to the point where, I don't know how much is going on now, but there were definitely people in that movement who were getting together and trying to say, okay, if we were able to democratically decide on, policies for as a movement, could we begin to democratically operate and actually run our communities, like Ben said, building local power, that libertarian left idea of autonomy. But like he said, it always starts with the conversations that we have with others. We have to rebuild who we are. We have to invest in the social organism, creating these social bonds between people that have been lost, that have been torn apart by the marketplace. I think that's where we start.
Great, thank you. I want to coalesce some of these questions that are coming in from the audience, and thank you for submitting these questions. I think they're really, really great. I'm going to put a couple of these together. I want to ask, what are some resources like websites or books or other media that you could suggest to people who are just starting out on this journey of learning and discovering about climate change and the impact on our planet? What are some books, organizations, websites, information sources that you could suggest for people? And then related to this, what are some everyday practical things that we can do or learn or pay attention to that can do a lot to address all these challenges we're talking about? Well, sorry, Victoria, do you want to start here again?
Sure. So recently I actually watched a documentary. It's on Netflix from Nova. It's called Decoding the Weather. And I found it really, really good at explaining the science behind weather and how that research is done, like at a really accessible level for anybody. So if you're interested in how we conduct research to back up the claims of climate change, like that would be a good resource. For just general information, I really trust the NOAA, NOAA, and NASA for climate research. I also like going on YouTube and seeing like other sort of people like around my age or a little older who are interested in like climate science and sustainability, and like seeing sort of how they have done things in their life to minimize their own carbon footprint. Like this one girl I follow, every time she flies on a plane, she'll purchase a carbon offset, which is basically a different company will plant a certain amount of trees based on your contribution, and that is supposed to offset the carbon emissions of your plane flight. So that's something I would recommend for anybody, is to look into your personal carbon footprint, because you can reduce it by carbon offsets, by seeing if your energy company has an option to change like all or a part of your power to solar and wind power. I also like using Ecosia, which is like it's like Google, but every time you do a search, it contributes to like their revenue, and they use that revenue to plant trees around the world. Oh, and also there's a Earth Day Summit. It's not just today, it's also tomorrow and Friday, called Earth Day Live 2020. And they're having panels all throughout the, today and the next 2 days about the Earth, if anyone's interested in that.
Great, thank you, Victoria. Lily, what about you?
I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen for a second. That's cool. Oh, 1 second. Okay. It's not actually working for some reason. But if you go to our Beescape website, it's beescape.org. There's actually an entire page of resources. Matt, I don't know if you have the ability to share your screen, if you could do that. Because my system preferences weren't updated to do that. So I would have to quit and come back on. But on our organization's website, if you go to Learn.
Can you see it?
Yep. So on the top, if you go to the Learn tab, there are links and resources to a bunch of information. It's mostly local to Bucks County and Pennsylvania, but there's also the U.S. Global Change Research Program, the Environmental Protection Agency. So there's global and national things as well. And then if you see in the top left, yes, so these are, so if you see the first link, if you scroll down, yeah. So that's our Beescape Google Drive. That is a compilation of all of our presentations and our research. And it covers topics for everything from animal agriculture, the effects of animal agriculture and what you can do, to the 2020 candidates for president, to the effects of deforestation and indigenous sovereignty. So if you need just immediate access to online resources of things that you just want to learn generally what is a good idea for being more eco-friendly, Beescape's link and resources and our Google Drive is a really good source for that.
Cool. Thank you. And I'll put these in the chat section there. Great. Ben, Dylan, are there resources that you could share or things that people can do right now to make an impact?
Yeah, certainly. So just in regards to books, papers, as I mentioned before, I really love Deep Adaptation by Jem Bendell. It's really a great read. I would suggest just people, if they like, just to spend a couple hours looking over it, because that's all it really needs. Because that, like I said before, has just really helped to kind of shape my views, and I think made me a little more realistic in regards to the climate crisis. Has helped us kind of determine what we can do that makes the most effective use of our time when trying to combat and adapt to climate change. And in terms of individual actions, like I was saying before, and like Dylan had also mentioned, so when it comes to building local power, one of the ways we can do that, living in a capitalist system, is to kind of, in a sense, refuse some market exchanges by becoming a little bit more self-sustainable. So what Dylan and I and our family have been doing a little bit over the past weeks is starting on building a garden in our backyard just so we can provide for ourselves, and with the surplus food, hopefully provide for some others as well. So that should be really great. And just on the subject of the food we consume as well, I think Dylan probably has a little to say on that.
Yeah, okay. So, sure. So I guess I could start out with just talking about what are some books or resources that I think would be good for anyone to check out. I haven't read a whole lot of books specifically about the climate crisis, but one that I liked was a book called Climate Leviathan, I believe it's called. And it's basically a Marxist analysis of, what can we do about climate change? And even in a sense, sort of, it almost in a sense a prediction of like, what are like the 4 possible futures that could come out of climate change? So it could be, a very sort of fascistic world, one that is sort of where capitalism manages the climate crisis, could be more authoritarian left, or we could have more of a socialist future. And it's kind of, it sort of takes a realistic look at what do they think is going to happen. And it's a good way to look forward to the future and say, well, there are a lot of different possibilities for how this could turn out, but we have to be realistic that it's likely that the forces of global capital are going to end up, making renewable energy companies very profitable and putting that to their own uses. But more importantly, along with what Ben said about like food choices that we can make as individuals, I think I really liked what Lily was saying, where she said that, we do need to get away from this idea that, what we do as individuals has this like giant impact on everything. And it's like so amazing. And like, okay, I'm not super into that. But I will say that, as a vegan and as an animal liberationist myself, I think that these choices can make an impact in terms of what they spur us on to do. So a lot of the things that I've found is that, some people may go pescatarian, may go vegetarian, but they, in a sense, you almost have to make that change. You have to go fully vegan in order to really understand, why do we have this relationship of domination with animals?
Yeah, and I think it's necessary to say, so Dylan and I, we are both vegans now, but we haven't been that way our whole lives. So for the majority of our lives, I'm thinking for me, it was, I'm 17 now. I'm pretty sure I was like a carnist, like an omnivore until I was 16. For Dylan, it was something similar, and he was a vegetarian before he was a vegan. So, like, we're not trying to be dismissive of carnist, vegetarian, or pescatarian views. Essentially, we're just laying out ours and hoping that, you come to those with an open mind, so to speak.
Right, and one of the things I think that can be good about individual actions that we've kind of noticed with veganism is that, individual actions fail as long as they stop there. So if you just go vegan and you think that, by not eating animals and not eating animal products, this is something that the animal liberationist YouTuber and Marxist Mexi loves to call vegan TM. If you just stop there, like trademarked, then in a sense, you're not really doing anything more than just making a moral stance as an individual. But if you take what you're doing as an individual, and if that really inspires you, and you put it towards broader ends as changing, what we do as a movement. Like, for instance, Ben and I have been really trying to get some animal liberationist demands into the Gen Strike 2020 Constitution. You were trying to open up a conversation about animal liberation on the left. And that's something that was inspired very much by the choices that we made as individuals. So you never know where your individual choices will take you. And so I think that, we've always got to remember, if you're making a choice as an individual, please try to find a way to fit that into what we can do as a collective. Because it's only as a collective social organism, all of us as human beings, as living beings, can we really make change, not as individuals. And I'll just link a speech by the great animal liberationist Gary Yourofsky below if anyone wants to know more about veganism and why it's important.
Great, thank you. We've almost reached the end of our panel today. I want to thank all of our panelists and all of our attendees. This has been a really great conversation. I want to encourage you to keep learning and exploring and growing in this as everyone has their own personal journey through and within this conversation and these ideas with each other. The last question I want to put to each of the panelists is, in your work in the climate change or the climate crisis, I want to ask you, what is a thing or an example or an idea that gives you hope for the future? Victoria, do you want to start again?
I think the most hopeful thing is just, well, I guess I have two things, is seeing how aware people are nowadays of even things like marine plastic, which doesn't feel like it's directly connected to climate change, but all the processes needed to make that plastic, contributes to emissions and all that. And also just all the science that's being done all the time around climate research. It's obvious to scientists that this is a topic that needs to be researched. It's just waiting for the policies to catch up. But I think once they do, we'll have all these brilliant scientists and working on the problem, and we'll be in a pretty good shape.
Great, thank you, Victoria. Lily, I know you wanted to add something on to Dylan and Ben's, and then can you tell us what gives you hope?
Yeah, so I just wanted to add really quickly that I am a vegetarian. So whenever I can choose a vegan option, I do. We don't have milk we don't use milk or eggs really in our house. We have oat milk and things like that. So but it sometimes is difficult for me as a teenager because of there's not always for everyone a super accessibility to these products. Sometimes if you're in a situation where where there's not a vegan option, because a lot of the time as teenagers we're not really in control necessarily all the time of what we can eat. So I would say that transitioning to veganism is a plan that I have, but it will be a process. And I think that it's important for everyone to remember that changing your diet is not an easy thing. And I think we all know that. Like, I used to eat meat all the time. I went to vegetarian. I'm sure it wasn't easy for Dylan and Ben to become vegan either. It's not a particularly really difficult thing, but it can be challenging for people who are used to eating the same way their whole lives. So I think it's just important to recognize that we need to be patient with ourselves and just make that transition.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I would say for myself, I remember I was like the biggest meat lover. I don't know if you remember, Ben, but like
Yeah.
I was that guy.
I can vouch for that for
Right.
sure.
I would eat ribs all the time. This was like, and I remember historically, I just remember this saying, you know, around the dinner table, I will never go vegetarian, you
Yeah, it's
know?
true.
Same. And here I am, and the thought of meat disgusts me. So it's like this process that we all go through. It's just me personally, because after being a vegetarian for so long, I look at it and I'm like, oh, that's not appealing to me at all.
Right.
Yeah, I'm a vegetarian too, and I can totally agree with that.
So it's just this thing that I feel like we need to be, as we transition, we need to remember to be patient with ourselves and remember that all that really matters is that intention matters most, because what we put into things is really what matters, because the fact that we are trying in the first place shows that we care, and it really influences other people's attitudes. And specifically what I was going to say was that what changed my life was a book that I read called Eating Animals by Jonathan Safran Foer. And it's something that I think that everyone should read. Everybody in the whole world should read this book. It does not matter if you do not turn vegetarian immediately after. It doesn't matter if you keep eating meat. But this book exposes so many things, from the corruption of capitalism to the mistreatment of animals in factory farms. And specifically, I wanted to talk about what Dylan was saying about how your attitude influences people, and about how it doesn't stop when you yourself turn vegan or vegetarian. Change happens when you influence other people. And what the whole point of what Jonathan Safran Foer was saying, at one point he says that although people think, oh, just because I go vegetarian, it won't have an impact on other people. But the reality is that the time where we as human beings bond with each other most is often at the dinner table. It's often in settings where we eat. There's this biological thing that happens when we eat together that kind of brings us together biologically. We give off these hormones and these these biological elements that connect us to each other. And so just by choosing and actively choosing what goes onto your plate and kind of really projecting that onto other people really can change other people's opinions, and can really make them start thinking about what they put on their plate, and really just change their worldview. And then they influence other people, and then it goes on. My mom was a vegetarian, and now I'm a vegetarian, and I wouldn't have known, necessarily what that looked like unless my mom influenced me that way. So that's that on that.
Yeah, and I think Lily made a really great point there, especially regarding, I guess, like, my personal beliefs regarding, like, should everybody be vegan or not? And my answer to that is no, not everybody has to, simply because I don't believe in coercing somebody just because I think an action is immoral or moral. Like, a good example of this could be, say somebody lives in a food desert, could be like a single mother with children. And if she just tries to eat vegan when she can, in the end, that's okay, because that's sort of how capitalism affects individuals.
Right. It's important.
You have to realize that, like, we, like, do have some sort of relative privilege, like
Right.
Dylan and I have been able to afford eating vegan, despite veganism actually being generally cheaper than a diet including animal products, right? Like there's a reason why like a good third of the world's quote unquote less developed population is vegetarian. They wouldn't do it if it wasn't economically affordable. However, just regarding like there are just situations where people sometimes they need that vegan processed food, and processed food in general is going to be more expensive. Not everybody can afford it, and not everybody has the money, so we really do want to be accepting of that kind of thing. Say, like eat vegan when you can, as really to the full extent that you are able, but we're not going to judge you if you simply cannot.
Right. And
People also have health complications that make them unable to have that sort of diet. And there's also, if you think about it, I just wrote an essay on whether or not we should eat local for my Lang class. And one of the arguments against it with the synthesis was that urban communities live much farther from the places of production of food, so their organic and vegan things are much less accessible to them because their only real outlet is supermarkets, and supermarkets tend to have much more artificial and processed things that are because they're farther away from the source. And it's not like all urban communities have the opportunity or the privilege to just go out and splurge on farmers market items whenever they have the chance. So yeah. I think it's just really important.
Ben and Dylan, really quickly so we can wrap up here, what are the things that give you hope in this struggle? So
it's very odd, it's a very strange thing, but as horrible as this pandemic is, and it has been tearing apart human lives. You have people, I remember hearing this on our school announcements a couple of days ago. There is a kid in our school, I believe is a junior or senior, and who she is still working a quote unquote essential job at a grocery store because her parents have been laid off. That's a great example of how this pandemic is doing horrible things to a lot of people because capitalists are keeping people in working to make profits. But at the same time, I think it's very strange, but one of the greatest things this pandemic has done is it has really exposed, the awful flaws in this capitalist system. The fact that when faced with a single crisis, it cannot provide for people, even poor countries like Vietnam and Cuba, which have their own problems with authoritarianism, are providing far better than our abundant, wealthy, capitalist United States ever could and is providing right now. And so I think that what we've been seeing with Gen Strike 2020, what we hope will happen is that there has to be systemic change now. People have to, however they can, whether it's striking, whether it's signal boosting, whether it's calling in sick, as these months go by in this pandemic, we have to start shutting down business as usual so we can get some of those key reforms passed, like the Green New Deal, like Medicare for All. And then from there, starting to build local power in our communities with our comrades. And honestly, I don't know I wouldn't have been calling for a general strike or anything like that before this pandemic had happened. I don't think we would have been ready for it. But we are at a crisis moment. We are seeing over 30% unemployment, and it's like the Great Depression. If we don't act now, when? If not now, when? If not you, who? That's really where I'm coming from here.
Yeah, and if anybody would like to get involved in the general strike, I'll just put the email that you can contact in the chat right there. So, like we said, no, I put it there, dude. You're good. So like we're saying, if you can get involved any way you can, it's really helpful. There are a lot of people and animals suffering from this coronavirus pandemic that's happening right now. So this is a way that we can make a change. And I think really when we get down to, sort of organizing a little more, helping out others in our communities, however we can, it really just creates a great feeling of bonding and togetherness. And that's something that gives me hope, that idea of local organizing with the people you know and love, just getting to know and love some more people too, some more animals, whoever, it's just a really great thing, that feeling of banding together in your communities and trying to help others.
Yeah.
I know I went on, about the vegan vegetarian issue, but I did want to answer this question. What gives me hope is the fact, so I always think about the way I think about change over time is that I feel like we've seen in history that change is slow and it's incremental. there are usually one or a few issues that get resolved or looked at a time over the course of history. For example, in the 60s, there was the civil rights movement and the gay rights movement and, you know, like the peace movement, the anti-war movement. And then, you know, in the early 1900s, there was the suffrage movement and there was a lot of other different, there was including environmental movement. So I think that what makes me hopeful is that you see this kind of passion, this kind of revolutionary fire that we've seen in past generations that have made this change in our generation. And it's about this issue. And it's because I see this kind of revolutionary thinking and this kind of ideology, the same kind of revolutionary thinking and action and organization that caused the change in the past is happening right now surrounding the environmental issue. So that makes me really hopeful that we will be able to make a change and change our world. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like Lennon said, you know, there are decades where nothing happens and there are weeks where decades happen. So
Yeah.
Matt, I want to thank all of our panelists for contributing today. Great insights. I hope that we all of those who are listening as attendees and are on the panel can go home and continue these conversations with the people that we care the most about. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, attendees. And enjoy the rest of your Earth Day. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.